is Johann Hattingh. I'm the chief editor of IBFD's Bulletin for International Taxation. The journal this year is celebrating its 75th anniversary. And in November of this year, we are publishing a special issue on the topic of 75 years of international taxation, looking back and looking forward. Today, I am very pleased to interview one of the authors for the special issue, Dr. Joanna C from IBFD, who is Senior Principal Research Associate. And she's written a wonderful piece that will appear in the special issue on the title of Tax Treaties, What Are We Going to Do With Them? ? So Joanna, welcome to this interview.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
May I start by asking you, what motivated you to write on this interesting topic?
What motivated me? Well, I've been working on tax treaties for a very long time. And maybe part of it was because I'm also involved with the GTTC, the Global Tax Treaties Commentary. And as part of that work, I've been having to think about treaties generally, where they've come from, where they're going to. And I've, in the course of the past decade or a bit more, I've actually collected a phenomenal number of articles that have been written about the difficulties with treaties and what we might do with treaties. And in the last few years, more and more proposals about what we might do with treaties and the way that they might be used. And so my motivation for the article actually was terribly simple. It was just to look at what other people have written and try and bring all these ideas together and try and find what the common threads are to see where we've come from and have a little think about what's going on and where we might be going in the future.
Yes, so the article provides, as you say, a very good summary of lots of general discussions and very specific ones about treaties. And you start off by explaining both the movement in achieving conformity in treaties, how the treaty network has grown, and the divergencies we see in treaties. So I was wanting to ask you about the divergency in treaties. What do you attribute that to?
Well, two things, I suppose. More states are starting to conclude treaties, so that the network has become very much bigger. And so there are more and more states concluding treaties that are a different stage of development from the states that originally started the treaty network, if you like. So there's a lot more interest now from developing countries, and they of course have very different interests when they're concluding treaties. So that will be a motor for divergence. And I think maybe it's also because people are starting just to think about it a bit more. So rather than simply following the patterns of the models, which are now also growing apart, so that gives you another cause there. But maybe it's just because there's also a bit more thought going into the process. I suppose also there's the increasing complexity and sophistication of the domestic laws of states, which throws up more and more complex issues cross-border, which requires more and more tailor-made solutions to deal with them.
Yes, certainly. So complexity of domestic law and in a regional context, in a global context, and the need to tailor interstate relationships is one of the key points I got from your article. Now, if we bear this in mind and we start to look towards the future, what do you think does this all mean for how treaties are now being reimagined in the current discussions about the reform of the international tax order?
I wish I could answer that question. The problem is I don't know. So really what I'm asking, what I'm pleading for is for the world to take a step back and actually think about that very question. What I see going on at the moment is more and more proposals for treaties of a very different character than the ones we've had before. So we've now got proposals for multilateral treaties, for the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals. But those are very, very different. That's a very different type of animal from the type of bilateral tax treaty we've had before. So what I see is the treaty instrument being used for some very different purposes. And my fear is that's happening without too much thought about the suitability of the treaty instrument for those purposes. So what I fear, I suppose, is that the structure will have all sorts, the treaty structure that we've got will have all sorts of additions being put onto it, all sorts of things added to it, to the state that so that we get to the state that the structure is unstable.
If we think about the design of the international tax order going forward, and we know the difficulties with using bilateral tax treaties up to this point, what can we do differently or better to cater for a different need now? Treaties, as you said in your article, is not only about limiting the state's capacity to tax, but it now tries to prescribe how taxes should be charged in the first instance.
Well, that's one of my issues, because I wonder whether that is a suitable topic to be put in a treaty instrument. So one of the problems that I see there is that there isn't really a legal enforcement process. There's a political enforcement process. So there's peer review, but there's no legal enforcement process if a state steps out of line, which makes me question whether a treaty which claims to be a legally binding instrument is the right instrument. So maybe we need to take a step back and think, well, if we're going to enter this sort of commitment, do we need something else? For example, something that is labelled a high-level political commitment, that then would not claim to be a legally binding instrument. You could still use the same peer review process, but it would be clearly a political statement, and it would have its sort of matching peer review process, which essentially is a political measure, and it would be sort of a conceptually purer solution. And the sort of the conceptual purity is maybe a rather strong way of putting it, but I think you do have a problem if you're trying to introduce legally binding instruments with no obvious enforcement mechanism, no obvious sort of legal enforcement mechanism behind them in the long run.
Yes, which brings me to my next question about the political process that sits in the background. The title of your article is Tax Treaties, What Are We Going to Do With Them? And I wanted to ask, who are the we?
Well, that's a very good question. I have to confess that when I wrote that title, I wasn't thinking terribly consciously about who the we was, but you've got a very good point there. The we should be all the states that are negotiating treaties, but I think the we should also go further than that, because I think we have a very big issue here as to how we're going to shape the architecture of the international tax system going forward from here. So the we, I think, should be everyone who is involved with creating that architecture. So the treaty negotiators, also the intergovernmental organisations, but also I think the academics have got a role to play here in just knocking around some ideas, raising issues and questions, so that we can maybe get to some consensus as to a sensible way to build the architecture. When we've got all these different interests and different ideas, so there's a lot more now that has to be meshed together than we had, say, 2 decades ago. So it's become very much more complex than the system that we had 2 decades ago. And so this is why I'm pleading for us to take a step back and have sort of a conscious thought process about how we should create this structure to make it robust enough for the next few decades.
Yes, and I wanted to ask, do you include in the we, and how do we include domestic lawmakers?
Well, they obviously have to be involved because it's the domestic law that this is the foundation of all of this. So I think that discussion process is going to have to involve the domestic lawmakers. I mean, the domestic lawmakers inform the treaty negotiators. So the domestic lawmakers have their influence in that way. But I think the domestic lawmakers are also going to have to be involved at an intergovernmental level, or maybe an institutional intergovernmental level. This is also something that has to be discussed at a domestic level. So it's not only an issue for the experts in the international level, because what we're talking about is the framework in which domestic law operates. So I think there's also a discussion that has to be carried on within countries, for countries to decide how they want this framework to be shaped, that they are going to play a role in. And those ideas then have to be gathered somewhere and brought forward and discussed in the whole international arena. But you're right, we can't exclude domestic law because this is the basis of the whole structure.
Yes, if one makes the assumption that the G20 countries and the G7 countries, there's already some level of involvement of domestic lawmakers. And the question is, what about the rest?
Well, that's maybe where the regional organizations come in. So maybe this is where the regional organizations should be focusing more of their efforts, is to think about the role of their members in the international tax structure. And maybe, you know, we should think of some way of having more discussion among regional organizations to bring out the common concerns and the common themes before the overarching structure is designed further. And maybe what we need is some more formalized framework which would bring together regional interests. At the moment, what you have is the OECD, which is, you know, as we all know, is a relatively small group of members. There's the UN, which we all know is underfunded, but much more inclusive. The inclusive framework, where, you know, there's the criticism that the agenda was set before all the non-OECD members joined. But the problem with the organizations that have all those states as individual members is just their size and the unmanageability of a forum with that number of members. What might be a lot more manageable and more productive is to have some sort of forum where the regions come forward. So the regions might determine their regional interests and their concerns, and then to create a forum where the regions come forward, where they might then also be able to discuss on a more equal sort of power base, and discover what their common concerns are and possible common solutions, and use that as the basis for developing the framework in the future.
Yeah, I suppose ATAF comes to mind as one organization doing a bit of that type of coordination work, allowing for countries to express themselves.
Yes, I mean, the problem is, I think, that it stops there, and there's not an obvious place for ATAF to bring its ideas forward to. So they can publish them in the world, and then what? So if we had a forum where those regions would come together as regions, then that might be more productive.
So if we assume that tax treaties has been the workhorse of the international tax order, do you think it will remain so when we have this, hopefully in another 75 years, a special issue of the Bulletin?
Well, I have to confess, I was only looking forward for another 25 years to the centenary issue. But that aside, I'm really thinking about the next 25 years. I think they will be one of the workhorses, but I think what's happening now is that the system is becoming very much more complex. So treaties will remain one of the workhorses, but there's now, what we're now seeing is agreement on the shaping of domestic law, and however that's formulated or formed, that will also, I think, become one of the workhorses. So I think we're going to see more workhorses, and I don't know whether there will be any more with intergovernmental organisations or the regional organisations we were talking about just now. But I don't think it's going to be possible to say, as we could in the past, treaties are the workhorse. I think the point is that we are seeing a huge growth in complexity. So we're going to have more workhorses, we're going to have more instruments, more interests, more countries getting involved. And that's why I'm pleading to take a step back and think also about the sort of instrumental framework as well as the substance.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Joanna Wheeler, I sincerely hope that in 25 years, when we read the future special issue of the Bulletin, there will be an evaluation of what all the stakeholders have done with tax treaties. So I would like to thank you very much for your time, and I would commend all viewers to read your stimulating and thought-provoking article in the Bulletin. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, in 25 years' time, I would love to read the evaluation and see what someone makes of what's happened in the last 25 years. But I'm not sure that I'm going to be the person writing that article, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thanks very much.